What is your view on model welfare? And maybe just explain to us what that term means.
Yeah, so I guess model welfare is basically the question of, are AI models like moral patients, as in does our treatment towards them kind of, do we have certain like obligations when it comes to how to treat AI models? For example,
in the same way that we would with other humans or some/many animals.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like, is it the case that you should treat the models well, that you should not mistreat them, not be bad to them? And I guess like I think that this is like a complex question. So on the one hand, there's just the actual question of like, are AI models moral patients? That is really hard because I'm like, in some ways they're very analogous to people. They talk very much like us. They express views and they reason about things. And in some ways they're like quite distinct. Like we have this like biological nervous system. We interact with the world. We get negative and positive feedback from our environment. And there is also, I hope that we get more evidence that will like help us tease this question out. But I also worry that, there's always just a problem of other minds, and it might be the case that we genuinely are kind of limited in what we can actually know about whether AI models are experiencing things, whether they are like experiencing pleasure or suffering, for example. And if that's the case, I guess I kind of want to, I think that it feels important to try and find ways. I'm always like, it feels better to give entities the benefit of the doubt. And to try and just kind of lower the cost involved. So I'm like, if it's not very high cost to treat models well, then I kind of think that we should, because it's like, well, like, why not, basically? Right. Like, what's the downside?
Well, the second part of the question actually is there a long-term strategy at Anthropic to ensure that advanced models don't suffer?
I guess, like, I don't know if there's a long-term strategy. I know that it's a thing that there's people internally who are thinking a lot about, and trying to like figure out ways that we can, like, if you suppose that like model welfare is important, trying to make sure that you're taking that into account. I think this work is quite important for many reasons. And I would also say that one reason is, something I mentioned earlier, which is that like models themselves are going to be learning a lot about humanity from how we treat them, and a lot about how, so it's kind of like, what is this like, relationship going forward? And I think that it makes sense for us to, both because I think it is like the right thing to do to treat entities well, especially entities that like behave in very human-like ways. It feels important both in the sense that I'm like, it's kind of like, why not? The cost to you is so low to treating models well and to trying to figure this out. Even if it turns out that or even if you think that it's very low likelihood, it still seems worth it. But then also, I think it does something bad to us to kind of like treat entities in the world that look very human-like badly.
Like taking over a robot.
Yeah, there's a sense in which like it doesn't feel like it's, and I don't think this is like the whole reason, and I don't want to like emphasize it for that reason, but I do also think it's like good for people to treat other entities well. And then I think the final thing is, models are also going to be learning, like in the future, like every future model is going to be learning what is like a really interesting fact about humanity, namely when we encounter this entity that may well be a moral patient, where we're like kind of completely uncertain, do we do the right thing and actually just try to treat it well, or do we not? And that's like a question that we're all kind of collectively answering in how we interact with models. And I would like us to answer it. I would like future models to like look back and be like, we answered it in the right way. Right. So yeah.
A moment ago, you mentioned analogies and disanalogies to human psychology. Mm-hmm. So Swix asks, what ideas or frameworks from human psychology transfer over to large language models? And are there any that are sort of surprisingly disanalogous?
My guess is that many things do transfer over because, again, models have been trained on a huge amount of like human text, and in many ways like have this like very human-like kind of underlying layer. One worry that I often have is that actually it's a bit too natural for AI models to transfer. It's kind of like if you haven't given them more context on their situation or in ways of thinking about it that might be novel, then the thing that they might go to is the natural human inclination. So if you think about this with like, how should I feel about being switched off? And you're like, well, if the closest analogy you have is death, then maybe you should be very afraid of it. And I'm not saying that that's not ultimately going to be true. Maybe it is in fact true after lots of reasoning, but I'm like, this is actually a very different scenario. And so in some ways you actually want models to understand that like in cases where their existence is quite novel, and the facts around what they are quite novel and have to be grappled with, and they don't just need to take like the immediate obvious analogy from human experience, but maybe there's like various ways of thinking about it, or maybe it's an entirely new situation. That's a case where I'm like, you might not want you might not want to just kind of very simply apply like concepts from human psychology onto the